For years, Wolfgang Van Halen was known primarily as the son of a rock legend. But in recent interviews, he has begun speaking more openly about the realities behind that legacy, his childhood, the pressures of expectation, and the personal loss that reshaped his life after the death of Eddie Van Halen. What has changed in his perspective, and why is he choosing to speak now? Wolfgang Van Halen was born into a world that most aspiring musicians spend years trying to enter. As the only son of Eddie Van Halen, he was introduced to the mechanics of music not through formal ambition, but through everyday exposure. Studios, rehearsals, and global tours were not distant goals. They were part of his childhood environment. From an early age, Wolfgang demonstrated a natural inclination toward music. He began learning instruments at a young age, eventually becoming proficient in bass, drums, guitar, and keyboards. Unlike many children of public figures, his involvement was not limited to observation. By the time he was a teenager, he had already begun integrating into the professional world that surrounded him. In 2006, at just 15 years old, Wolfgang officially joined the band Van Halen as their bassist, replacing longtime member Michael Anthony. The decision drew immediate public attention. While some viewed it as a natural evolution within the band, others questioned whether Wolfgang had earned his place or benefited from his family connection. This scrutiny followed him into every performance. Interviews from that period reveal that Wolfgang was aware of these criticisms. Rather than responding publicly, he focused on refining his abilities. Over time, his technical skill and stage presence began to shift perceptions. He was not only performing existing material, but also contributing creatively, signaling a deeper level of involvement. However, the environment came with an underlying complexity. Growing up in such proximity to a legendary figure created a constant comparison that was difficult to avoid. Public narratives often framed him in relation to his father, leaving limited space for independent identity. Internally, this dynamic could create pressure, balancing admiration with the need to define his own path. At the same time, his upbringing provided access to mentorship that few could replicate. Eddie Van Halen was not just a father, but also a direct influence on Wolfgang's musical development, offering guidance rooted in decades of experience. This combination of opportunity and expectation formed the foundation of Wolfgang's early life, a foundation that would later shape both his confidence and his challenges. But beyond the stage and the expectations tied to his name, what did Wolfgang's private world actually look like? And how did those early pressures begin to affect him in ways the public could not see? While Wolfgang Van Halen was publicly recognized as a young performer touring with Van Halen, his private life followed a more layered and less visible path. Growing up in a globally recognized family meant that even ordinary moments were often subject to attention. Privacy was limited, and expectations, both from the public and the industry, were present from an early age. In later interviews, Wolfgang described his childhood using balanced language. He acknowledged the opportunities that came with his background, including access to world-class musicianship and mentorship. At the same time, he emphasized that these advantages did not eliminate personal challenges. The assumption that privilege equates to emotional ease was something he would later challenge directly. One of the most defining changes in his early life came in 2007, when his parents, Eddie Van Halen and Valerie Bertinelli, finalized their divorce. At the time, Wolfgang was still a teenager, already navigating the pressures of public performance. While both parents maintained a supportive presence, the shift in family structure marked a clear transition. It introduced a new level of emotional complexity during a formative period. Simultaneously, Wolfgang became increasingly aware of his father's health struggles. Eddie Van Halen's long battle with cancer was not always publicly detailed in real time, but its impact within the family was significant. For Wolfgang, this meant confronting uncertainty earlier than many of his peers. The experience added a layer of emotional awareness that extended beyond music and performance. These combined factors, family change and health concerns, contributed to a gradual shift in Wolfgang's perspective. Rather than viewing life solely through the lens of career progression, he began to develop a more introspective outlook. Interviews suggest that this period played a role in shaping his understanding of resilience, stability, and personal identity. Despite these challenges, he continued to perform and fulfill professional responsibilities. However, behind the scenes, a quieter transformation was taking place. He was beginning to process not just what he was expected to be, but who he wanted to become. This internal shift would later influence both his creative work and his willingness to speak more openly about his experiences. As these personal challenges continued to unfold, a deeper question began to emerge. How could Wolfgang define himself independently while still carrying one of the most recognizable legacies in rock history? As Wolfgang Van Halen moved into adulthood, a clear shift began to take shape in how he approached his career. While his early years were defined by performing within the structure of Van Halen, he gradually started building something that existed outside of that framework. This transition was not sudden, but intentional, driven by a need to establish an identity that could stand independently of his family name. That effort led to the formation of his solo project, Mammoth WVH. The name itself carried historical significance, referencing an early iteration of his father's band, but the music reflected a distinctly different direction. For Wolfgang, this was not about recreating the past. It was about acknowledging it while moving forward on his own terms. What set Mammoth WVH apart was the level of control Wolfgang maintained over the creative process. He wrote the songs, recorded the instrumentation, and performed nearly every part himself. This approach allowed him to shape the final product without external expectations tied to the Van Halen legacy. It also demonstrated a level of technical proficiency that challenged earlier assumptions about his role in music. When the debut album was released in 2021, it was met with generally positive critical reception. Reviewers noted its strong composition, cohesive structure, and the clarity of Wolfgang's artistic voice. Importantly, the conversation began to shift. Rather than focusing primarily on his lineage, critics and audiences increasingly engaged with the music itself. Beyond technical skill, the album revealed a more personal dimension. The lyrics and tone suggested introspection, with themes that pointed toward identity, pressure, and emotional processing. In interviews, Wolfgang confirmed that the project was deeply personal. He described it not just as a career step, but as a way to define who he was outside of external expectations. This phase marked a turning point. For the first time, Wolfgang was being recognized not only as the son of Eddie Van Halen, but as an artist with his own voice and direction. However, just as this independence was beginning to solidify, events beyond his control would interrupt that momentum, forcing him to confront a far more personal and irreversible change. At the moment when Wolfgang was finally establishing his own identity, a profound loss would reshape his perspective entirely. But how would this experience influence the music and message he had just begun to define? In October 2020, the death of Eddie Van Halen marked a defining moment not only in rock history, but in the personal life of Wolfgang Van Halen. After a long and widely reported battle with cancer, Eddie's passing triggered an outpouring of global tributes. Musicians, fans, and industry figures reflected on his influence, innovation, and legacy. But for Wolfgang, the loss was far more immediate and deeply personal. In public statements shared shortly after his father's death, Wolfgang described Eddie not just as a musical icon, but as a central figure in his everyday life. Their relationship extended beyond rehearsals and performances. It included shared humor, private conversations, and a consistent presence that shaped Wolfgang's development both as a musician and as a person. This dual role, father and mentor, meant that the loss carried both emotional and structural weight. In the weeks that followed, Wolfgang made the decision to step back from public appearances. Unlike earlier periods of his life, where he maintained a steady presence through touring and media, this time was marked by absence. The pause reflected a need to process grief away from public scrutiny. When he eventually returned, it was through a medium that had always defined his connection to his father: music. In November 2020, he released the song Distance under his Mammoth WVH project. The track was explicitly dedicated to Eddie and included archival footage and personal moments in its accompanying video. Rather than a general tribute, it offered a direct and unfiltered look into their relationship. The release of Distance also marked a subtle shift in Wolfgang's public communication. While he had previously maintained a level of privacy around his personal experiences, this moment introduced a more open tone. Interviews following the release reflected a willingness to speak about grief, memory, and the complexities of growing up within a high-profile environment. This period did not represent a complete transformation, but it did signal a change in direction. The boundary between Wolfgang's public and private identity became more permeable, allowing audiences a clearer view of the person behind the role. As Wolfgang began to open up in ways he hadn't before, a new question emerged. What parts of his past had remained unspoken until now, and why did this moment finally lead him to share them? In the years following the loss of his father, Wolfgang Van Halen gradually began to speak more openly about aspects of his upbringing that had previously remained in the background. Unlike earlier interviews, which focused largely on music and performance, these conversations introduced a more personal dimension, one centered on reflection rather than promotion. Importantly, Wolfgang approached these discussions with a measured and balanced tone. He did not frame his childhood as defined by hardship, nor did he present it as untouched by difficulty. Instead, he described it as a combination of privilege and pressure. Growing up in a globally recognized family provided access to opportunities that few experience, but it also created expectations that were often unspoken yet constant. One of the recurring themes in his interviews has been the challenge of identity formation. Being closely associated with Eddie Van Halen meant that Wolfgang's achievements were frequently viewed through a comparative lens. This dynamic was particularly visible during his early years performing with Van Halen, where public criticism sometimes focused less on his abilities and more on his last name. Wolfgang has acknowledged that this type of scrutiny had a psychological impact, especially during adolescence. Navigating public opinion, while still developing a sense of self, introduced a level of complexity that many of his peers did not face. He has also referenced moments of personal insecurity, noting that confidence was something he had to build over time rather than inherit. At the same time, he has consistently emphasized that these experiences contributed to his growth. Rather than distancing himself from his past, he has worked to understand it in a more nuanced way. This includes recognizing the support he received from both parents, as well as the lessons learned from early exposure to both success and criticism. This shift toward openness has allowed audiences to see a more complete picture, one that moves beyond assumptions and highlights the realities behind the public image. It reflects a conscious decision to engage with his story more directly, without exaggeration or simplification. As Wolfgang continues to share these insights, a new layer of his journey becomes visible. But how has this deeper self-awareness influenced the way he approaches his career, his public presence, and his ongoing transformation? The transformation of Wolfgang Van Halen has not been defined by a single moment or public announcement. Instead, it has unfolded gradually through consistent changes in how he presents himself, communicates, and approaches his work. This evolution reflects a deeper process of self-definition, shaped by both personal experience and professional growth. In recent years, observers have noted visible physical changes, as well as a shift in Wolfgang's overall confidence. Public appearances, interviews, and live performances now reflect a more assured presence. Where earlier interactions often carried a degree of restraint, his current communication style appears more direct and comfortable. On social media, he has also become more willing to address criticism, clarify misconceptions, and express his views without relying on carefully filtered messaging. Professionally, his continued work with Mammoth WVH has played a central role in this transformation. Touring schedules, new releases, and live performances have reinforced his identity as an independent artist. His music increasingly reflects a mature perspective, incorporating themes of loss, resilience, and personal reflection without losing structural clarity or technical focus. At the same time, Wolfgang has shown a greater openness in discussing topics that were previously less visible in his public narrative. Conversations around grief, mental health, and identity have become more present in interviews, suggesting a shift toward transparency. This does not represent a complete departure from privacy, but rather a more balanced approach, sharing insight while maintaining personal boundaries. This transformation also aligns with a broader cultural pattern among younger artists. Rather than distancing themselves from influential backgrounds, many choose to reinterpret them. In Wolfgang's case, this means acknowledging the impact of Eddie Van Halen while continuing to define a separate creative direction. The result is a narrative that is neither rooted solely in legacy nor entirely detached from it. Instead, it reflects an ongoing effort to integrate the past into a forward-moving identity. As this transformation becomes more visible, an important question begins to take shape. How are audiences responding to this more defined and open version of Wolfgang? And does it fundamentally change the way his story is understood? As Wolfgang Van Halen has become more open about his personal experiences, a noticeable shift has taken place in how he is perceived by both audiences and critics. Earlier in his career, much of the public narrative centered on his connection to Eddie Van Halen. His role in the band, his musical opportunities, and even his early achievements were often viewed through the lens of inheritance rather than individual effort. However, recent years have introduced a more layered understanding. With the release of his independent work through Mammoth WVH, combined with his willingness to discuss personal challenges, audiences have begun to reassess his journey. Critics who once focused primarily on comparisons have increasingly evaluated his work based on composition, performance, and creative direction. This reassessment is also tied to a broader awareness of context. Fans now recognize that Wolfgang's early exposure to fame came with pressures that were not always visible. Entering a globally recognized band as a teenager meant facing scrutiny at a stage of life typically associated with development and self-discovery. Public criticism, expectations tied to his last name, and the emotional impact of personal loss have all contributed to a more complex narrative than previously acknowledged. Importantly, Wolfgang himself has played a role in shaping this shift. Through interviews and public statements, he has consistently emphasized that while his background influenced his path, it does not define his limitations. He has resisted being reduced to a continuation of his father's legacy, instead positioning himself as an artist building something distinct. The result is a more nuanced public image, one that balances recognition of his origins with acknowledgement of his personal growth and achievements. This evolving perception reflects not only a change in how he is viewed, but also a broader shift in how audiences engage with artists. With this more complete understanding now taking shape, a deeper question remains: what does Wolfgang's journey ultimately reveal about the long-term impact of legacy, and how does personal resilience shape the way that legacy is carried forward? The story of Wolfgang Van Halen represents a convergence of legacy, identity, and ongoing personal development. Over time, his journey has moved beyond initial assumptions, offering a more detailed understanding of what it means to grow up within a globally recognized name, while attempting to define an independent path. His recent openness about childhood experiences, combined with reflections on loss and personal growth, has provided audiences with a clearer view of the challenges behind his public image. Rather than presenting a simplified narrative, Wolfgang's story reflects a balance between opportunity and pressure, visibility and privacy, inheritance and individuality. At the same time, his continued work through Mammoth WVH demonstrates a consistent commitment to building a future based on his own creative direction. Each release, performance, and interview contributes to a body of work that is increasingly defined by his personal voice rather than external expectations. What stands out is that this process remains ongoing. Wolfgang's transformation is not framed as a completed arc, but as a continuous evolution. His willingness to engage with topics such as grief, identity, and resilience suggests a level of self-awareness that continues to develop over time. This openness also reflects a broader cultural shift. Audiences today are more receptive to complexity, particularly when it comes to public figures with inherited legacies. Wolfgang's story contributes to this shift by offering a perspective that is grounded in reality rather than mythology. As he moves forward, questions remain about how his experiences will influence his future work, both musically and personally. Will his continued openness shape the themes of his next projects? Will his evolving identity further redefine how legacy is understood in the music industry? Now that a clearer picture of his journey has emerged, the question extends beyond Wolfgang himself. How do stories like his reshape our understanding of legacy, and what do they reveal about the true cost and meaning of growing up in its shadow?